Are we all here? Hi, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Zoom session with Bill Gray. There's Bill. I just wanted to let you know before we start that for our current students, we will announce open sessions for questions very soon, and I would love for you to participate. And I would also like to express my great admiration for those of you working under these critical circumstances. From what you've told me, I can't believe what you're confronted with, really, and what you have to put up with. And I hope, as bad as this is right now, that in the end, hopefully, this will be a step in the right direction for humanity, and that we will learn things. So with this, I give it over to Dr. Gray.
Well, good morning, everybody, or everybody that is morning for. For those who don't know me, I'm Bill Gray. I've been practicing classical homeopathy, mostly for chronic disease, for 49 years, almost 50 years. And let's see, I think I'll turn my email off so it doesn't keep dinging against you here. Can you see me okay?
Yes.
Okay. And my original training, as some of you may know, was with George Vithoulkas. I actually went to Greece and studied there for 3 years with him directly, and then promoted his teachings throughout the world. And so what I'm going to be talking about today will partly be his teaching that I learned from him, and then also as I evolved in my evolution as a homeopath, I began learning from other great teachers in the world, and that won't so much come into play in our discussion today directly, but what I will share is how I made a transition from C-potencies to LM-potencies and why I did that and so on. So my plan, but I'm flexible, so if people want to talk about other topics, just chime in, and once I see a trend, then I can change speed. But I'm assuming most people are relative beginners, and so potency is a characteristically large topic. It's a kind of a joke in homeopathy is, once you've analyzed the case and you come up with the remedy and so on, then beginners usually ask, what potency did you give, and how did you give it? And I understand that because there's a lot of technical stuff around potencies, and we, through our allopathic training, are kind of programmed to think in terms of dosages of medications and that sort of thing. But the kind of common joke amongst experienced homeopaths is the answer to, well, what potency did you give? The answer is whatever we have available. It doesn't really matter whether it's a C-potency, an LM-potency, a Q-potency, any of those things is kind of irrelevant. If you choose the right remedy, then the resonance will work for the patient anyway.
Excuse me? Miss Barbara, we're not seeing Mr. Gray talking. We're seeing you. Is it possible to switch him so that we can see him, please?
I see him too.
Nice to meet you, Jason.
Hello. And so one of the questions that frequently comes up is that many people leap into, giving LM5, LM8, or LM10, etc., and then, the patient will aggravate, and then they'll say that was the wrong remedy. And then some of us, like I was taught, you start with LM1 and you give, X number of drops, and you stay the course or go, gently going up each level over time. So if you could talk about, if you could.
I will. That'll be part of when I get to the LM part. I will talk about that exactly. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That's
Yeah,
something.
thanks, Jason. Yeah, it's true. There's all kinds of different styles. So one more preliminary comment I want to make about my Vithoulkian training that shapes what I'm going to be saying in the about potency is you have to remember that I learned from Vithoulkas early on about antidotes, and that does make a huge difference in the way the potencies are used over time. So you'll hear different homeopaths use C-potencies and LM-potencies and everything in different ways than I may be describing here. But they also very likely, or in many instances, are not going to be having their patients avoid antidotes. So my training with George right from the very early days was favorable to antidotes, and I proved it in my own practice. And the last session that I did talked a lot about that, so I won't dwell on it. But understand that to start with, if patients are not observing antidotes, coffee, camphor, antibiotics, and so on, then they will be interfering with whatever style of dosing you prescribe, and therefore you'll have to make adjustments to overcome the antidoting effect that they're putting into their case. So what I'm talking about is, you might say, pure cases where they're conscientiously avoiding coffee, camphor, acupuncture, antibiotics, and then the statements that I make here will apply in that situation. So the way I learned to do C-potencies from the very early days, and I assume everybody knows how those are prepared, so I'm not going to go into that. And it doesn't matter if it's course of coffee in or not, those kind of things are never made a difference in practice as far as I could see. But the way I was taught in chronic cases, well, let me start with acute cases. Let me comment. There, frequent dosing is appropriate and needed, and following the intensity of the symptoms is the best way to go with that. And so, if somebody has coronavirus, for example, you might give 4 doses in an hour, and then once an hour after that for about 6 doses, and then 3 times a day for a few more days. And you can increase that or decrease that as needed as the patient progresses. So that's just off to the side. That's standard, and I think all homeopaths pretty much observe that style of prescribing. In chronic disease, you have to be more careful, and you have to be very careful with C-potencies, and I'll try to explain that. So the classic way that I was taught and that I used for probably 35 years was I would take the case, decide on the remedy, and then I have remedies in the office, but you could order it for somewhere else or do a prescription to a pharmacy. And it would start with 1 dose of the C-potency. I usually would do it in the office, and then nothing, or maybe daily placebo, which is commonly done, for actually a very long time, months, even years, before you give a second dose of the C-potency. A lot of homeopaths do different dodges to avoid, patients would like to be taking something every day. It's hard for them to believe in 1 dose in the office and then just wait forever. And it's a gradual improvement. And so they would like to have things. So it is common practice. I know Vithoulkas, at least back in the days when I was training with him, would typically give a daily placebo. And that might be a cell salt or remedies that are conscientiously chosen with a vibration that's far from the constitutional remedy. Let's say you're giving sulfur, then you might give arnica or hypericum or something like that as a placebo, so that you're not interfering with the constitutional. There are some homeopaths. When I met Marjorie Blackie in UK, she used to do, and a lot of British homeopaths used to do 3 doses instead of one dose. And their reasoning was that what if something interfered or something was wrong with the dose? Then if you give 3 doses, you might get a better response. What I saw over time was occasional cases where people would respond instantly to the first dose that's given. Then on the second day, they would see an improvement because it's interfering with the first dose. And then on the third day, they would respond again to the remedy, and that's with a healing crisis or a homeopathic aggravation. So early on, my habit was not to do 3 doses. I would just do the 1 dose. And then it is with C-potencies in chronic cases, it's almost required that they have a healing crisis. That can be instantly, it can be right away, or more typically, it comes around 7 to 10 days later. Often, well, actually, my notes here are wrong. Usually I would see it around 4 days, and then maybe around 7 to 10 days, and it would last for a few days or a week. And by a homeopathic aggravation, I mean an intensification of the symptoms that the patient brings in the first place. That's the main thing. But also sometimes symptoms that belong to the remedy itself. In other words, a proving symptom. And provided that you're just giving the 1 dose and waiting, then that clears up in a few days, maybe a week. It depends on the case. Then the typical pattern for follow-up would be to follow up in 6 weeks, and then to look for improvements by laws of cure. We're only looking for a 10 or 20% improvement. And this is true actually for LMs when we get to that. The pace is the same whether it's C-potencies or LM-potencies. So by 6 weeks, there's a 10-20% improvement, usually energy first, emotional changes first, and then maybe deeper physical changes like asthma or something. And then the more surface changes would be coming later. But by the 6-week mark, it would be the early changes by Herring's laws of cure. And then if you don't see that by 6 weeks, it's probably the wrong remedy. So then you retake the case and prescribe a new remedy and go another 6 weeks. If we do see a 10-20%, which is slight improvement, then we go 3 months. And in 3 months, the average case is usually an improvement of around 50 to 80%. I mean, the pace of change is rapid at first in the first few months, and then it becomes a kind of tail end phenomenon after that over many months, even a few years. Most chronic cases can be cured in a span of maybe 2 years. But that, of course, depends. I mean, if somebody's been sick for 30 years, then it may take longer. And if they've only been sick for 6 months, when they come to see you, then of course the improvement by the second follow-up 3 months after the first follow-up will be very dramatic and maybe even complete by then. So like I started, antidotes apply. And actually it's a very important factor in C-potencies especially. And that's what I'm going to get into here. So how do we know if the remedy's been antidoted? So as people go along after their first dose, there are good days and bad days, good days, bad days, and it just keeps going like that. And people are always looking for very quick responses. And there's a temptation, and it's a very prominent temptation in early years of practice, because I've been there and done that. I can say this with authority, that the complaints from the patients are intense. And so you think, oh my God, it's the wrong remedy, or I have to give another dose, or I have to give some other supportive dose, maybe a lower potency or something to help them get past this suffering. You have to try to avoid that, especially in C-potencies. You have to try to avoid that impulse. In C-potencies, it's not, the timing of the doses has to be governed by the homeopath. It should not be governed by the patient. And so you have to try to resist these momentary changes. But if somebody does drink coffee or they use antibiotics or something, they can have a relapse from that, and then you're in a dilemma. By relapse here, I mean not just a good day, bad day phenomenon, but a real relapse, even a full relapse or headed towards a full relapse over a span of 1 or 2 weeks, depending on the case, of course. If you see that, then you're seeing an antidote, and then you're confronted with a dilemma. If you give a dose too soon, let's go back to what I was saying before about good day, bad day. If you jump in there with a dose too soon, then that dose will interfere with the first dose and cause a setback. That's a very important thing to understand. A lot of homeopaths, when that happens, they think, oh, it must be a potency problem. And so then they'll start working up on the potency scale and trying to overcome that. But what's actually happened is that by giving a dose too soon, they've interfered with the first dose. I'll give a case to illustrate this and to show how careful this has to be carried out. Early in my career, probably maybe 15, 20 years, I had a case, it was probably about 10 years actually. I remember I was in Sebastopol then. I had a young man who had Zollinger-Ellison syndrome, which is recurrent peptic ulcers, presumably from as a genetic basis. It runs in families, but that gene has variable penetrance. So I learned from this case actually that you can overcome that with a homeopathic remedy. And his remedy happened to be sulfur, and I gave the 1 dose, and I forget now whether it took 2 or 3 months, but after a span of time like that, he was completely free of symptoms. He had no more. He previously had been hospitalized 2 or 3 times a year with bleeding ulcers and he had recurrent and chronic pain and bleeding ulcers, and they were threatening to remove his stomach, and everything was really desperate when he saw me. Sulfur, within a few months, cleared that up completely. And for people who ask me what potency it was, I think it was 1M. But I make that as a joke because it was whatever was available. But 1M is what I gave. And he went for another at least a year. It may have been more like 14 months or something. And had no symptoms at all. He was doing extremely well. And then he developed poison oak. It's a region where it's a very intense area of poison oak, and he's a farmer. And so he was exposed to poison oak and was suffering horribly. And I was afraid to give a dose. Even though it was sulfur and it fit the poison oak symptoms, I was afraid because if I gave a dose too soon, I could set him back. And so I held off and held off and held off. And if I remember correctly, it was a month of him coming in probably every week or calling me on the phone saying, I just can't stand this anymore. It's not getting better. And so finally I thought, well, all right, then I'll take a chance. I don't remember what potency I gave, but I gave him another dose of sulfur. And overnight, the poison oak disappeared and his ulcers started bleeding again. Overnight, by the next day. And then I didn't know what to do. So I figured, well, okay, I'll just try another dose. And that didn't work. And I think it was in that case that I invented a technique of trying to increase the potency, but doing it in tiny steps. So I had the pharmacy make 1M plus 1. In other words, they run it through the pharmacy potentizing process, and it's just 1M plus 1, not going all the way up to 10M, because I was afraid to do that. And the 1M plus 1 didn't work. I can't remember for sure, but I probably then went to 10M, and that didn't work. So then I started trying other remedies, arsenicum, I believe, and even rust hawks, because he was reacting to the poison oak. And anyway, I lost complete control of the process. He was bleeding out. He became very, very anemic. And there was no choice finally but for them to do surgery and remove his stomach. So that's a lesson that stuck with me throughout my entire career. That what I had learned in my early years is very true. And the more serious the case, the more careful I am with C-potencies not to give a dose too soon. And too soon can be even a year, year and a half too soon. So this is very different than what you may be hearing from other teachers. The usual reason for that difference when people say, oh, you give it every week or you give it every day for a while or you do this and that and the other thing is because they're not having their patients avoid coffee, camphor, antibiotics. And so the antidotes are constantly interfering with the doses, and to get the effect, then you have to keep giving the dose. But in the long run, by giving a dose and antidoting, giving a dose and antidoting, you end up creating chaos in the system. And then you have a disrupted case, and that can be extremely tricky to prescribe for. Actually, I saw many cases throughout my career that had been treated by other homeopaths who'd gotten into this exact situation where the antidotes and the dosing and the antidotes and dosing and changing remedies led to a severe disruption of cases. And then what you have to do is spend, and typically, this was very unusual for me, I would spend 3, 4, even 5 hours trying to trace back through the history of the case where he or she last felt the best, and then when things started falling apart, and then retaking the case at that point, and then also retaking the case at other points and looking for threads that stay consistent throughout the disrupted case. Even though the remedies and the antidotes have changed the picture all over the map, there's usually some kind of a pattern that you can look for. It may only be a couple of symptoms. And then you prescribe on those, and that can bring order back into the case. And then, of course, you have the patient avoid the antidotes, and that'll pull you out of a disruption like that. I've done that many times in my career. It's a very hard process to do, but that's how you solve that. Okay. So I've covered this. So overall, I would say the C-potency experience that I had over 35 years in chronic cases. I estimated at around that time that I was getting, maybe, if I was really honest, I was getting about a 30 or 40% cure rate. I don't mean just an improvement rate. You can get a 80, 90% improvement of symptoms here and there. But in terms of the whole person being stably better for a length of time, really my success rate, and maybe that's just maybe I'm not a great prescriber. Many of you might be better than that. But for me, 30 or 40% was a pretty honest evaluation. And from my point of view, I was frustrated by that. Of course, compared to allopathic medicine, that's still pretty good. But compared to what I believe homeopathy can actually accomplish, I was frustrated by that. So that's when I started my search for other solutions. And of course, the 6th edition of the Organon talking about LM-potencies made me wonder about that. And I started a search about LM-potencies throughout the world. I was teaching at that point a lot in Europe, and I met people in Germany and in the Netherlands and in Belgium, and actually in Norway too, but primarily Germany and Netherlands, I would say, who had different approaches to doing LM-potencies. And I didn't know how to choose between them, so I just started picking up what I could from them and going forward with that. And it took me about 5 years to settle into the pattern that I'm going to describe to you now. Let me see if the next slide helps you with that. Well, what I found was the first experiment I remember was a group in Germany that was claiming that LM-potencies do not produce healing crises. They don't produce a homeopathic aggravation. And I thought, oh, that's wonderful. That's what I was struggling with. And so I tried that, and that didn't work. And then I saw other people who would do, in other words, I could get results from the LM-potencies, but it is true that I did see aggravations. Even in acutes, actually, I saw aggravations with LM-potencies. And it wasn't as routine. It wasn't as every single time the way it is with C-potencies, but it was very common, and so their teaching was wrong. What they would then say, there was another subfaction of that group that said, well, okay, if there's sensitivity to the LM-potency, they didn't like to call it an aggravation. They would call it sensitivity. So then they'd say, you try multiple dilutions, going, serial dilutions from the original LM-potency, and that gets you away from the sensitivity. I tried that, and that didn't work at all. They were not using distilled water, which I later learned was very important for both C-potencies if you're plussing, and also for LM-potencies, certainly. And but anyway, so I experimented with that. That didn't work. I tried mixing C-potencies and LM-potencies. I tried to give a C-potency and then try to mitigate the aggravation that would happen by giving LM-potencies. That works a little bit, but it didn't really resolve the problem. And it wasn't true that you didn't see healing crises with LM-potencies. Then to answer Jason's question, I did see homeopaths who were saying that you need to adjust the potency according to the severity of the illness, like some of the training in the C-potency realm, which I never thought actually panned out. And or you go to higher potencies if it's more of a mental problem then you give higher LMs. And if it's more of a physical problem, you give lower LMs. In C-potencies, a lot of homeopaths think that way still, I believe. And my experimentation with that didn't matter. With C-potencies, I felt bold to go high if it seemed like a clear case, a very clear case to me, to my understanding of the remedy. Then I would go higher. But if I was not very certain, then I would stay lower, around 30 Cs. Same with LMs, I experimented with higher and lower, and I didn't see any difference there. Then I came to a way of using LM-potencies where you just start at the low potency at LM1 and you work up and as needed. If somebody relapses, then you go to the next higher potency. If they relapse again, you go to an even higher potency. And the nice thing about LM-potencies was that they don't really do harm in the classic way that a C-potency can. It doesn't seem to be possible to engraft a proving, although maybe by the end I'll tell you about one story where it did happen just recently in my practice, but I don't think it's relevant for this theme right now. In general, LM-potencies are pretty benign, so it doesn't have to be governed by me choosing when to give a dose or to change potency or anything. It's, well, changing potency, yes, it is governed by me. But in those days, patients were empowered to just play with it themselves. And so they would start with an LM1 and then go up, and usually in a few months or so, they'd end up going up. And of course, my patients were still avoiding antidotes. So I'm describing people who were careful about coffee camphor antibiotics. And even they were having relapses and needing to go to higher potencies. So I had a slew of patients that were up and around LM20, LM30. My entire practice was in that range. And I was beginning to realize, this took maybe 2 years, I think, that I realized that almost none of my patients were getting better. There was something really wrong with what I was doing. And so I started inquiring with every patient, when was the last time that you felt better? And I would say something like 80% of them said that they felt better after the first LM1. And after that was when they got worse. And there was a handful of people who they said they felt better after an LM2. So then I learned that this idea of just going up and down the potency scale doesn't work in practice. So it was around that time that I finally came across, thanks to Valerie Ohanian in Minnesota, who, by the way, learn from her as much as you can. She's a wonderful homeopath and a wonderful teacher. And she gave a talk at a conference describing how she does LM-potencies. And I adopted that. And that's the way I've been doing it ever since. It's been almost 15 years now. Along the way after that, I discovered by conferences and conversations with Elise Timmerman and her whole group of Dutch prescribers that meet every week and discuss cases, that same approach to LM-potencies that Valerie was describing works for them too. So there was a lot of clinical experience behind it. Oh, let's see. Okay, so yeah, in my notes, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Let me do a diversion just to head off some questions that might be there. There is a discussion between, there's a difference between LM-potencies and Q-potencies. In Europe, they have better access to Q-potencies. And my good friend, Massimo Mangialavori, He swears by Q-potencies, and I agree with that, but the availability of Q-potencies is limited in the pharmacies that I've been using. So personally, I use the LM-potencies, which are made, as you know, LM-potencies are started by, actually, I think it's 3X. I think my note is wrong here. I think it's 3C. You start with a 1 to 100, and then 1 to the 100, and then 1 to 100. Then you go 1 to 50,000. So it's a 3C up to a 50,000, and it's all in liquids. And the Q potency is different. It also does 3 steps of 1 to 100 dilutions, but it's not liquid dilutions, it's trituration dilutions. And so, and that appears to make a difference clinically. So once you have the 3C by trituration, then you go to 1 to 50,000 into distilled water, and that's your Q potency. So LM potencies and Q potencies numerically are the same, but the way they're made is different. There is a lot of confusion in homeopathic circles. Searched around to see what other people said about this, and there's a lot of confusion. A lot of people think that LM and Q potencies are identical. They're just different names for the same thing. But there is actually a difference in the way they're prepared, and there is a difference in clinical response according to people who use the Q potencies. Those are more effective. And I tend to believe that, but I haven't validated that myself. Then, of course, there's a side issue. If you're a follower of Lise Timmerman, she invented the C4 potency, which is an LM potency. Instead of using C3 to start with, she goes up to C4. So it's really a Q potency made from C4 because it's all by trituration. And to comment on that, in making remedies from original sources, I went through a phase of making a bunch of animal remedies from wild animals that, from a sanctuary in Montana that let me do this. And we made milks and bloods from all kinds of different wild animals that were salvaged or rescued from their wild environments when hunters had killed the parents and stuff like that. And then they were raised. And we made remedies. And there we made it by trituration. And it's very interesting to do that yourself, because what you have then is an actual spiritual experience, and I can say it only that way, a psychic experience of the remedy of the animal. I'll never forget doing grizzly bear and doing the trituration. I felt, huge, and I felt like I was on top of the mountain looking down on everything. And the more I would triturate, the more I got this feeling. And that matches what Elise describes on the C4 potencies. The C3s would give you these kinds of experiments, which are like provings of the remedy. But the C4 actually takes you to another spiritual dimension that she describes a lot. And it's very interesting to hear her talk about that. I haven't validated that. I'm just mentioning it out of curiosity and interest. I think you'll be fascinated by that. Okay, so the way I do LMs is from Hahnemann Pharmacy here in California, and I order a 1 ounce bottle with a dropper and 20% alcohol and distilled water. And then I have the patient, every time they take a dose, so I don't know if you can see me. Can you see me? Or you only see my slide? Anyway, I won't demonstrate it. You take the stock bottle and pound it 10 exact times, not 9, not 11. Then you take 7 drops, and approximately, this is really sloppy. I say it's like cooking, I do it in the dark even, take 7 drops and put it in half a cup of distilled water, and then the patient takes a sip of that, or they can drink any amount or all of it. By then, it's just a vehicle to get the energy into the body. It's not a dose of a substance at all. So it doesn't really matter how much or how little they take. For people who are in ICUs or whatever, they don't even have to take it, you know. You can just put it on their skin as long as it gets into the energy aura of the body. And by the way, I have had patients who don't hear me about distilled water, and they do it with tap water, and nothing happens. They come back and say it was the wrong remedy, but I'm confident of what I gave. And sure enough, when I inquire, you know, they say, oh, I didn't know that. I've been using tap water. So then when I switch them to distilled water, sure enough, the remedy works. So that's an experiment that's been done probably half a dozen times over the years. And people who just haven't heard me correctly or haven't communicated well. So to talk a little about the physics of what's going on, I may skip this, you already know it. I'll try it real fast. We do know the physics of all potencies, whether it's C-potencies, LM-potencies. When a molecule is surrounded by water molecules and buoyed in water, that's how it's diluted. It's held by water molecules by hydrogen bonding. A shell is formed around it. When we succuss it, it breaks that shell into smaller clusters. And when we dilute it, it expands their size. And these have been measured and visualized in electron microscopy, atomic force microscopy. I wrote a book on this. So the energy is held in these nanoclusters made up of water, but held together by the same energy as the original substance. So that's how the potency is made in the first place. And then the frequency diagram there shows the resonance that is needed to cure. So if you're off on the shoulder a little bit, if the remedy is not exact, in other words, in its choice, if you're giving, oh, I don't know, sulfur instead of kali sulfuricum, or vice versa, then you won't get the same effect as if you're right at the peak of the resonance curve. That's why we have to be so precise in our prescribing. So that fits the physics resonance principle. Anyway, to continue. So after they pound it and dilute it, they take one dose a day for 20 days and stop. That's a training period that's sensitizing the body to the remedy. Once it gets the idea, then it goes on all by itself. Weeks, months, literally years, without needing another dose. And you can sort of think of the 20 days of the LM potency as equivalent to the single dose of a C potency. And then I do the follow-up at 6 weeks, and I'm looking for the same thing, 10 to 20% improvement by Hering's Law. And if I see that, then we go 3 more months after that. There may be a healing crisis. I think that's probably in the range of 15 to 20% of the time. It's not anywhere near as common as it is in C-potencies, where it's almost required to go on to cure. You have to have a healing crisis. With LMs, it may happen, and if it does, it's a good sign. And if it's and if it doesn't matter. You can still go on to cure. One thing I think I forgot to put in my slides here is occasionally somebody will be very sensitive even to the first dose of the LM. Typically the healing crisis on LMs comes in the 2nd or 3rd week. And like I say, it lasts a few days or a week and then clears up. Occasionally, and this is pretty rare, it's probably 5% of the time, somebody may react right away to the very first dose, not positively, but having an aggravation of their symptoms. One great advantage of LM-potencies is that in that case, you can mitigate that by reducing the number of succussions. So instead of using 10 succussions and 7 drops, you go down to 8 succussions and 7 drops. And in some cases, even down to 6 succussions and 7 drops. Typically below 6, in my experience, doesn't do much good. I have students that have experimented even below that, and they confirm in their experience that that it seems to make a difference there. So one of the great things about LM-potencies is that you can mitigate the response in an oversensitive patient by the number of succussions. The mythology that I learned originally of doing serial dilutions does not pan out in experience. Even with sensitive patients, that does not reduce anything. And actually, now that we know the physics, that would just be maintaining without, if you do serial dilutions without more succussions, you're just keeping it at the same potency level by the physics of it. So there's no point in doing serial dilutions. I think it's more psychological, if anything. So my experience then, to summarize, my experience is that with C-potencies, the cure rate is probably 30–40%. A lot of that is because giving a dose too soon can really disrupt the case. And also, if there's an antidote, then you're in a dilemma whether to wait out the antidote and hope the body recovers, or to give a dose of the C-potency again and take a chance of setting them back. All those complications in the C-potency realm keep us from taking a case all the way to cure very often. So like I say, it's maybe 30–40% in my practice. With LM-potencies, we have less healing crises. If there is an antidote, if there is a real relapse, then you can actually give a dose, or sometimes you need to give, if there's an antidote, for example, and there's a relapse, then I've discovered that you have to give a dose a day for like 7 days to overcome the relapse. But the beauty of LM-potencies is you can do that with impunity, and it works. It does work. So there's a lot more flexibility in the LM-potencies, and the cure rate is much higher. I would say it's in the range of 80%, something like that, total, compared to C-potency. So I do advocate LM-potencies these days. I think it's a big innovation. It's a big learning curve getting there, but maybe you can take advantage of the learning curve I went through and follow this method that Valerie and Elise Timmerman and so on advocate. Oh yeah, the other real advantage to LM-potencies is if something new happens to the patient's health, if they get coronavirus, or if they get a flu, or if they have a major injury or something, then you can use the constitutional remedy in LM-potency with impunity. So if they get an acute, you give the constitutional remedy, and they're over it overnight usually, if it's the right remedy. So you're using it safely for both acutes and chronics. It doesn't always work for acute, but I'd say probably 70–80% of the time, the one that's working for the constitutional chronic condition will also work for the acutes. It's not 100%. Okay, so I think that completes my slideshow. If there's any questions, I'm sure that, ooh, it looks like there's a lot of questions. Okay, Let me see what I can do with this. Okay, let's see. Oh, okay, here's a question about a prophylactic for the COVID. Well, I'll tell you my experiment. I don't think, I mean, I followed Jeremy's share. I've communicated with Massimo. I've seen Rajan's take on this. And so homeopaths throughout the world and their students are still trying to find the so-called genus epidemicus. And I don't think there's any clear evidence of that. Jeremy's probably got the best handle on it that I've seen. But he hasn't come up, well, he recommends aconite as a preventive. I happen not to agree with that necessarily. What I did in my practice, I have a side business where remedies are made into electronic versions. And I sent that out to, because it's an energy, you can make it into an MP3 file. And so I sent that out to all of my practice, and they have sent it out to their extended families. So that's probably in the range of 3,000, maybe 4,000 people now. And it's been just a little over 6 weeks that I've been giving this version of Bryonia 30C once a week. And then I've been inquiring of my practice whenever I see patients, and they also have another way that they can connect with me if they actually get sick. Then there's a way to get acute treatment. I won't go into all that, but it's a way for me to track. So far, I have not seen one of my patients with extended family, 3,000, 4,000 people with coronavirus since taking Bryonia once a week, Bryonia 30 once a week. It happens to be a 30 because that's the way you make it into MP3s. Do I dilute the LM? No, I think I already answered that. Yeah, some people, they'd make it directly from the pellet. I've never done that, honestly. I just am lazy and let the pharmacy do that, and then I get the preparation from the pharmacy. So I'm not a good person to answer that question. But yeah, I think it's just one pellet. Some people say 2 or 3. I think the reasoning behind that is it doesn't change the potency at all. It's just you want to make sure that every pellet is actually absorbed the liquid when it was originally made. You know, so if you have a pellet that missed getting the liquid on it, then of course that pellet's no good to you. I think that's probably not true because there's a lot of sharing of potency between pellets. But anyway, that's the reason why some people do more. Wow, here's somebody who's a researcher on all this. She knows more about it than I do. Cure water itself with homeopathy. Okay. Yeah, sure. You can contact me and we can talk about it. I have no experience with that at all. I've never cured water. I just cure patients and animals.
Bill?
Yes?
That is me, that I sent you that message. And my thought of it, it was more on what you said about water and potency, and why it makes sense to me that one dose should be enough and we should wait for a long time. Because in water, it's like the ripples in the water. Once you, in a quiet pond or in a very big pond, you put a drop of water, you have to allow that those waves will go through the edge of the water and come back and go back and come back until the water's still again. But if we keep adding drops, the water keeps rippling back and forth in different directions, and that makes entirely sense. Because
you get a disruption.
Completely. And we are water. and vibration frequency, once we have the substance vibration frequency inside of us, the ripples in that water inside of us has to do
I think that analogy is real apt. I've used that a lot in my explaining to my patients. One thing about healing water, though, you have to be careful, because if there's minerals in the water, which there usually is, that disrupts these nanoclusters. That's why I insist on using distilled water when you administer the LM-potencies to people, because if they use water that has minerals in it, the force of the minerals breaks up the hydrogen bonding of the nanoclusters, and it'll destroy it. So,
and when I talk about healing water, it's about lakes. You know, like this is one of the things that I'm researching, is what is making the water sick, and most of the chemicals that are coming inside of a lake, for example, coming from runoff of roads, and have these heavy metals present. So the water is vibrating at a certain, the energy of this water is vibrating at a certain level.
I think using the vibration of the remedy in that circumstance might make sense.
Yes.
But using water as a vehicle to transmit that vibration may not be the optimal way. We ought to talk about that on the side. Okay, let me see here. Pharmacies in Europe, well, there's a few pharmacies. Goujon's is the main source of C-potencies. I'm not really up on this, but you can research it. I think there's others in Europe that do sell C-potencies. But I know Hahnemann in California, it's not strictly Q. They're LM-potencies. Somebody asked, can you drink the whole cup of water? I think I answered that. Yeah, the amount that you take once you've made the potency is irrelevant, because the water is just a vehicle. So a drop is literally the same as the whole thing, because it's just transmitting the energy of the remedy. So literally the whole thing is not stronger than just a drop. It's also not weaker to do a drop. And the question here about, can you boil water and let it cool? No, because what happens then is the minerals are still contained there. Sterilizing, and this is a big confusion in India, the homeopathic, the pharmacies in India, pharmacists are completely confused between sterile water and distilled water. Sterile water just means you've gotten rid of the bacteria, but the minerals are still there. Distilled water is where you've boiled the water, and then you've let it condense down a tubing into another container. And in the process, you lose the minerals because they're heavier. And then you get pure distilled water. And it's the minerals that are the enemy of the potency. Okay, let me see if there's any other questions. Let's see, so a question of, can you give the LM for a month? Or just give 20 days, and how did I continue with that, and then continue with placebo? Actually, I haven't tried continuing with placebo with LM potencies. I did in the early days, I experimented with 30 days. It just seemed like a good round number. And what I discovered was that people who were going 30 days often ended up getting an acute illness during the last 10 of the 30 days. And the remedy didn't seem to be working for that. So, so I learned to just do 20 days. Okay, yeah, here's a good question about odd numbers of potencies. That's a good question. I forgot to mention that. I have learned that now, doing it the way I've been doing it for 15 years, you start with LM1, maybe after a few years or so, 15% of people, maybe 20% of people might need a higher potency. After maybe 6 or 8 years, they may need a even higher potency. And I discovered in practice that going up to an LM2 didn't seem to do much. And then talking with Elise Timmerman, the Dutch experience with this whole group of 100 or so homeopaths that are sharing their clinical experiences all the time, they discovered the same thing, that the LM2 and when needed, LM4 didn't seem to work so well. So I don't know why that is, but it's a clinical observation. So LM1, and then I go up, if I need to go up, I go up to LM3, and very rarely, maybe LM5. Nowadays, if I'm up to LM5 or LM7, I'm reevaluating the remedy altogether, because it may be that it's just not the right remedy, even if it's done some good for a number of years. It's very rare to have to go higher, very rare. One observation, one thing I've learned just in the last couple of years, maybe now 3 years, is the same phenomenon that I described about C-potencies does tend to happen with LM-potencies also in a way. If somebody, let's say around 6 months, if they have a relapse and they try their LM1 and it's not working, then the temptation is to go up to the LM3. And I did that routinely, and for a long while I didn't think I was seeing any problems, but I gradually learned in the last 3 years that that actually is a mistake. You have to wait for maybe a year, year and a half before going up to LM3. Because I was seeing people, if I did sooner than that, I would set them back, kind of like in my C-potency days of giving a dose too soon. It was a very similar phenomenon. And then it was a dilemma. If you set them back at a higher potency, what can you do then? And what I usually do then is try to just wait things out as best I can without making any other interventions. And maybe trying a few LM1s again in more frequency, but not going back up to LM3. And I saw a number of people who had that response to the LM3. Over the 3 years, I've seen a couple of those be able to then adjust, and their bodies seem to be ready for the LM3 now. And that's still a preliminary experience. So I'm very cautious about going up in that way with the LMs. I was going to tell you a funny story about engrafting provings with LMs. I had a patient, I think I might have mentioned this actually the last time for people there. They may have already heard it, but a child in Canada, daughter of a MD, who was very kind of delayed in development and essentially retarded and being slow in school and so on. And she, I gave her LM1 of Boretta carbonica, and she was magically much better. She became social. She started acing her studies in school and doing extremely well. And then they had a visitor in the home who drank a lot of coffee, and the daughter was cleaning the dishes and exposed to the coffee, and she relapsed back to her retardation state. And so I told the mother, okay, just give more doses. I think I didn't go to a higher potency. I just said give more doses of the remedy. And the mother, wanting to get a good result, instead of pounding 10 times the way she's instructed, she pounded it 40 times and gave doses for 2 weeks. And the daughter got worse and worse and worse. She became almost autistic with that. And so the mother called back, what's going on here? That was the only time I've ever seen in my practice an LM do anything like engrafting a proving. And so the way out was I had her drink a cup of coffee to antidote the remedy and then take a dose of the LM1 again. Of course, the mother gave 2 cups of coffee And sure enough, the daughter was instantly better. And then she took her extra dose. And now I've had another follow-up. It's been about probably 3 months. So it was last January that all that happened. And she's still doing extremely well in school. I just had a follow-up a few days ago. So that's a funny story I wanted to tell you. So LMs, if they're misused, can turn out to be problematic. Since you give LMs for such a long time, are you saying that you give them their constitutional remedy? Yeah, this is all constitutional prescribing using LM-potencies. By constitutional, I don't mean a potency. C-potency doesn't mean constitutional. LM doesn't mean constitutional. Single remedy is constitutional, but looking at the whole person to cure the whole person and their chronic conditions, that's what I mean by constitutional, whether you give a C-potency or an LM-potency. Yeah, and if they relapse, you give a dose of the LM1. One dose is usually enough. If it's a simple relapse, if it's an antidote, usually it's a week's worth of daily doses. Okay, looks like most of the questions. Is there somebody with a burning question that wants to jump in?
Hi.
One that might be relevant. LM-potencies in cases where the patient's also taking steroids or inhalers. Oh yeah, I do that constantly all the time. And steroids and inhalers do not antidote the same way antibiotics do, but it is a kind of a, as I put it, the parking brake on the system, trying to run the car with a parking brake on. It is suppressive, and so it takes longer to go to cure. And so there you can use LMs, even more frequent dosing, to try to wean them off the steroids or the inhalers. And that works extremely well. Or blood pressure medications and so on, where you have to wean people off. That's a whole other seminar, I'm sure, to talk about all that. But the LMs are very useful because you're not doing harm by giving doses to help them over the withdrawals that they get from weaning off the drugs. So that's a very big advantage. C-potencies in the United States, I just don't know. There may be. I don't know the answer to that question. Any more questions? This is fun for me, I guess, just to hear my voice going all the time.
Bill, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Can everybody hear me? Nod. Yes, good. Well, I just wanted to make an announcement before everybody goes. The CHC needs the support of homeopaths right now, which has to do with their process of being accredited. And they've sent out a job analysis. And if you have gotten that, please, please do it, because this is really important to us that the CHC keeps their accreditations. That was it. Bill, I give it back to you.
That is important.
Bill?
Yeah.
Dr. Gregoire, how you choose between a C-potency and an LM-potency when you take a case? What factors do you have in mind to make that decision?
Nowadays, when I take a case, I don't even consider C-potencies. For the last 15 years, I've used only LM-potencies for acutes or for chronics. And they are just as effective. There's no question about that. It's just as effective. The time it takes to cure is the same, and it's much more manageable with LMs, so that dealing with antidotes and complications along the ways, the flexibility with LMs makes it much more possible to bring a case all the way to cure compared to C-potencies. The only reason I gave the bryonia in a C-potency as a preventive is because that was the only way I could do it with this electronic version I was talking about.
Ray, I have a couple questions.
Yes.
It sounds like you're ordering your LM remedies as needed rather than having those in your own pharmacy. Is that true?
Yes. What I do is I order directly from Hahnemann and they mail it to the patient, usually
Oh, I
within a
see.
day or two if it's in the local area.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, it's so much easier. People who do the pellets, they can have those stored in their own office and then make it up themselves. And that's perfectly acceptable way to do it. But for me, it's just, I'm lazy. I just do an email to the pharmacy and they mail it out and the patient pays $30 and it's real straightforward. I mean, this is kind of off the subject, but I think now that I think about it, the idea of handling the pellets makes me a little bit nervous. I made a observation very early in my career with C-potencies mostly, that homeopaths were unusually difficult to treat. I mean, I would still say that now because they've got so many ideas in their head about what their remedy might be and so on, and that you get more of their knowledge of materia medica than you get the story of their actual case. But I mean, even getting past that, I found that it was hard for the remedies to work very well. I really learned this from Michael Quinn, the guy who founded Hahnemann Pharmacy, now called Hahnemann Labs. He found it very difficult, and we all homeopaths that treated him found it difficult for him to be treated. And we finally concluded that it's because he was handling remedies every day on a routine basis. So that was a motivation for me a long time ago to just order from the pharmacy instead of handling it myself. That's a side thing, and I wouldn't call it scientific.
Well, as a follow-up, this is something I missed, but are you telling your patients to succuss 10 times before every dose?
Every dose, that's right. With LM-potencies, what you're doing every time you pound it and dilute it is you're stepping up one step in potency. And the body's always looking for a little higher potency. And if you try to just stay at, well, for example, if somebody has been doing remedies in LM constitutionally and they've done well for a few years and they've taken their initial 20 doses and then maybe an extra 10 doses for an accidental antidote or for a flu or something like that, their body is adapted to the LM1 plus a bit, 30 doses worth. So if they lose their bottle, this becomes an issue. And then I order a new bottle, LM1, it's down on a scale. It's at the bottom of the scale and it won't work. So what I have them do when they get the new bottle is estimate the number of doses that they've taken from the original bottle that they lost and multiply that by 10 and take the new bottle and pound it that many times. So if it was 20 plus 10, that would be 300 poundings before their bottle is up to the speed that their body is listening for. If you understand that.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Another side little technical thing is a lot of my patients are Indian and they go to India, and it's always a question because it was very difficult, almost impossible to get distilled water in India. It turns out now, Amazon, you can order distilled water on Amazon in India, so that's obviated. But for a long time, that was a difficulty. And so what I would have them do is before they go to India, to get some little vials at a container store or a bead shop or REI or some mountaineering store or something where they, carry tablets or vitamins or something in it, and have them prepare the remedy in advance, pound it, dilute it, and then instead of taking it, put some of that dilution in the vial and mark that vial number 1 and throw out the excess water. Same sitting, take the stock bottle, pound it 10 times, 7 drops, half a cup distilled water, put it in vial number 2, mark that number 2, throw out that distilled water, and then you can take the stock bottle, pound it again, and keep doing this and do 3, 4, 5, 6 pre-prepared doses that they carry in these little vials with them. It's easier to go through customs that way and all that, the TSA. And then they don't have to pound it or dilute it or anything else. It's already made. If they get sick when they get to India, which is really common, they just take vial number 1. And if they need, vial number 2. And then when they get back, if they haven't used all their vials, the instruction is to complete, as they need doses, they complete those vials before they go back to using their stock bottle, which is already up higher on the scale. I know it's hard to explain, but it's just a kind of a mathematical thing of higher potency and the body being adapted to a higher potency each time you take a dose.
And do you request that the TSA people don't put those doses through the X-ray machine?
I've never had to say anything about that. They just put it in their luggage, and it seems to go through without a problem. And also early on with C-potencies, and it's true, honestly, I haven't tested this I have sort of tested it with LMs. I brought my remedy through TSA and let it X-ray. I purposely sent even my first aid kit and all kinds of things through the TSA just to find out if it was at all a problem. And those remedies work just as well, like for first aid and that sort of thing. So I don't think the TSA radiation interferes with remedies.
That's good to know, because I've been holding them back every time I travel.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. A lot of people are afraid to do that, but I figured if I just take my some of the LMs that I did bring to Europe to demonstrate, and I would use them on patients that I would take, and also my first aid kit, which I used a fair amount when I was teaching, and I never saw a problem. That all seemed to work. Somebody asked about mineral water. No, that has minerals that would destroy the nanoclusters. If clients have moved from LM 1 to 2 to 3 using, and then not doing so well, I gather, should they drink coffee to go back? No, I don't do that. I just take them back to the LM1. If I put them up to the LM3 too fast, I just put them back to LM1 and give them multiple doses, and that seems to work fine. And then somebody had a question about a patient that was natrum muriaticum and then went to lycopodium in C-potencies and to give them LMs. Yeah, if you have somebody who's been on C-potencies, switching to an LM is perfectly easy. You just do it like you would anybody else. Whichever remedy seems to be the right remedy for them in that moment. You just give them the LMs, and it's a lot gentler, it's a lot easier, and that'll sustain them longer so they have less complications from antidotes and so on. So I think we're about out of questions, and I'm ready to get on with my day. I hope everybody is too. I hope everybody is safe and free of coronavirus. I wish everybody luck in treating their patients on that. We should have a discussion someday about everyone's experience.
Thank you, Dr. Gray.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
The next time.
Are the slides, will the slides be sent? The PowerPoints be sent?
I'll send that to Barbara and then she can distribute it.
Great, thank you.
Well, usually we put
Thank you,
up
Sharon,
these
ma'am.
seminar, just so you know, so I don't get too many emails. Usually we put these seminars onto our webpage. So if you wait about 10 days and you go to our webpage, there's a whole webinar page and you can see the previous one as well.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Barbara.
you.
Thank
Nice
you.
to
Thank
see
you. Thank you,
all.
sir. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much. Have a good